Right. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak. So I'm Clare. I coordinate Environment Wales, and we work to support community-led action on sustainability in the environment. When I was first approached about speaking here, I was given a title of sort of what defines a sustainable community, and that's quite a big and quite a hypothetical question, because what we find is that communities differ so much in their culture, in their locality, and the different issues that matter to people. That's a very broad question. So instead, I opted to look at some of the lessons that we can draw out of our experience of 22 years now of working with communities on these sorts of projects. I'm going to focus particularly on the climate change agenda, because that is arguably the biggest environmental challenge facing us, and one that's really going to impact on our community's health, prosperity and resilience. But before I start, I will just give you a whistle-stop tour of Environment Wales, and apologies to those of you that might have heard this before. Okay, so some of you may know Environment Wales was set up in 1992, and it brings together some of the leading environmental organisations in Wales, as well as those supporting the third sector. We came together to deliver support for voluntary action on the environment, and we recently celebrated our 20th anniversary. I believe that our long track record is largely due to the fact that we've always set out to be more than just a grant stream. We see our role instead as a development mechanism, as an enabler of environmental projects. We know that giving out grants and just expecting them to be automatically well used and deliver fantastic results is just not enough. What we know that groups need, especially those just starting out or entering new fields, is sort of long-term support and advice. Support to develop new project ideas, get ideas off the drawing board and into reality, identifying potential barriers and sorting out some of the inevitable hiccups and bumps that will arise as we go along. So our job, therefore, is to provide the fertile soil to help groups develop ideas, put them into action. We do this by providing groups with a dedicated development officer, DO for short, with whom they can build a long-term relationship, and who will be available as a source of advice and support for as long as it's needed. This applies whether it's the very early days of getting a group together, constituted, working out basic budgets and policies, to much larger aspirations if groups are identifying new projects or wanting to change their legal status or whatever. The DOs aren't intended to be experts in any of these fields, but they can provide networking, examples, case studies, and provide a signposting service to other groups that might have been through the same experiences, or relevant agencies that can also offer support. The DOs are employed by the partner organisations you saw earlier, and therefore carry with them the expertise and knowledge of that organisation as well as the knowledge that's built up by supporting, on average, about 50 projects throughout Wales. So this leads to tremendous potential for networking, like-minded groups, and also sharing information and best practice. We're also a grants provider, and although our pot is relatively small, it's about 600,000 a year, we know that we can maximise its results if we use this in an intelligent and accessible way. We therefore offer a range of grant streams that are tailored to each stage of project delivery, whether it's start-up to help groups just come together and maybe hold their first event or public meeting, training grants, support for feasibility studies before a project even gets into being on the table stage, and then larger grants to help employ staff or undertake larger project activities. We provide hands-on support during the application process, recognising that you might be brilliant at managing a woodland, you don't necessarily have the skill set to be a fundraiser. We have prompt turnarounds of usually less than 5 weeks, because again, the waiting game for those seeking grants can often, it's a time of uncertainty and stress. And because the development officer works closely with groups and is involved in the grant monitoring process as well, it gives us as a funder an insight into what we're actually doing, what we're funding, and the impact this is having on the ground. We also from time to time operate other more specific grant schemes for the Welsh Government on climate change or biodiversity, but our model is always the same. providing practical DO support, and that's the DO team, as well as grant aid. So what we're aiming to do is therefore to support, signpost, network, guide and hopefully inspire currently projects from more than 300 community groups and social enterprises across Wales. We have a Wales-wide remit, we provide a fully bilingual service, we support a very wide range of activities. If it benefits the environment and it's volunteer-based and volunteer-led, then there's a strong chance that you'll be eligible for our support. As I said, we support anything from very specialist species monitoring to carpet recycling, and we work with all sorts of groups, from entirely volunteer-led community groups to large social enterprises and charities with turnovers certainly larger than ours. So working with that range of projects and coming from so many different localities and backgrounds, we feel that we're in a very privileged position to know what will benefit communities, and we want to share those lessons really with anyone who will listen. So thank you for the opportunity. The work that we do is all geared at helping communities make sustainable development goals a reality. And part of that work on SD includes, of course, action on climate change and community resilience. And this comes in many forms, some less immediately obvious than others. Community-grown food with its links to the wider local food agendas. What can start off as a growing project can develop into sort of food co-ops, veg box schemes, biodiversity spin-offs, and also links to larger scale land use. Recycling. Community curbside recycling schemes. We've got green waste and composting. We provide feasibility support for potential new recyclates. Where are my pictures? And there's most recently the sort of fair share in the food waste recycling projects. There's a lot of work going on with energy, whether that's energy efficiency or education. Woodland management is another key area of our work, providing links to sustainable fuel, again very strong on skills, education and training, and also acting as carbon sinks, which is important. Many of these organisations running these projects have an understanding of sustainable development, and particularly climate change can be a key driver for their actions. I've called these groups the Keen Greens. They're a real ally to us because they don't only get on with their work, but they're actively engaged in trying to involve other people. They're trying to model sustainable living and get other people on board. But there are also many non-environmental organisations who may be working to a completely different set of priorities that nonetheless want to take action on sustainability. I've called these the Keen Non-Greens. So as Environment Wales supports projects rather than organisations, we know about a huge number of green projects from non-green groups. For example, a community nursery wishing to trial reusable nappies instead of disposables. We had a youth club campaigning against single-use carrier bags. A citizens' advice bureau running an energy efficiency day for its service users. There's also another group of organisations that I'm going to talk about, which I've named the Incidental Greens. As I said, whilst some of the projects previously mentioned have set out with a desire to take action on climate change or resilience, there are many others who are also contributing to this agenda without it necessarily being their prime motive or driver. We've got allotment and food projects that have maybe been set up for therapeutic reasons to help those coping with mental health difficulties or substance misuse. Sustainable forestry used as a route to engage those on alternative curriculum activities or community service. Recycling and reuse schemes set up to help address rural unemployment. Green space enhanced or reclaimed to provide a safe route to schools. And what we've seen increasingly in recent years is environmental projects being developed to help with the skills agenda, training and work placements. One of the key messages that Environment Wales has drawn from its 20-year history is the importance of recognising what's already being done, not just by the environmental sector, but by these incidental greens, in ways that don't necessarily use SD as I said, as their primary driver or message. Environmental organisations and those with a specific remit to act on the environmental SD account for less than 5% of the third sector. That leaves around 30,000 organisations in Wales with other competing priorities and tight budgets that need to be encouraged and supported to act. We know that community-led projects deliver multiple benefits. They're a cornerstone of SD and a crucial part of building social capital and resilience. In our experience, community-led environmental projects deliver multiple benefits in spades, and there's an emerging evidence base to support this. Some of the larger environmental organisations have been able to invest in research to demonstrate the value of their work to other health, educational, social services agendas. TCV can demonstrate that for every £1 invested in its green volunteering, a £4 saving is later made to the NHS. Groundwork's YouthWorks project gives a one-to-one payback within about 6 months to the criminal justice system, police, probation, social services, etc. However, trying to access money from those budgets to support projects like this is very, very difficult. If we're serious about encouraging more community action on sustainability, then it needs to be properly resourced in ways that recognise the nature of the third sector and also the multiple outcomes that projects deliver. There are some barriers to this that those in this room might be able to help address. As most of you know, for those who've not even considered climate change or resilience before, we cannot just go marching in with an agenda and expect people to sign up. Communities and community groups work at their own speed, and action is galvanised by what people feel matters to them. But as previously highlighted, there are so many routes into this agenda: food poverty, fuel poverty, combating antisocial behaviour, providing safe routes to school or places for children to play. All of these can be brought together to deliver, outcomes for our future generations. We have to understand the concerns of the people we're working with and let groups develop their own ideas and solutions. It takes time and trust and doesn't happen overnight. However, as demonstrated by the Keen Greens, there will be potential projects out there that we as funders or decision makers will never have even thought of, and which can be highly effective. We can draw these out by providing consistent demand-led support, which is flexible and preferably also long-term. Quite often this sort of approach of small, localised actions that don't necessarily follow a consistent theme can appear piecemeal or patchwork, and not as exciting or dramatic as a more focused programme that might have specific goals and targets from the outset. But in our experience, this is what works when it comes to engaging people. And what often starts out as small initial steps into the climate change agenda can develop into much larger projects. I realise I've skipped a few slides, so bear with me a moment. This is what I meant to show you when I was talking about multiple outcomes and measuring value. And these are just a summary, really, of the main ways I think we can address barriers to community action on this agenda. So the first one, yes, is to provide the support to enable first steps. In those organisations that don't have a specific remit to act on this, they've got many other competing priorities. We can't just give these organisations that simply do not have the time or capacity to invest significant resources in this. We need to give people a route through, as it were. Often these are organisations that might not have a clear understanding already of some of the issues in this agenda, and typically they fall below the threshold of support of some of the existing programmes. We need to help make it real, make it directly relevant, to those organisations whose priority might be fighting disease or tackling disadvantage or promoting equality or whatever. Because there is a high chance that there are projects that can meet those concerns and priorities and also deliver for the SD agenda as well. Why third sector action is important is that not only are there a large number of organisations, but those organisations have the potential not only to work to change the way in which they themselves operate, but to reach hundreds of thousands of staff, volunteers and beneficiaries with whom they already have a trusted relationship. Research shows that many of us get our information and change our behaviour, not from the media, not from newspapers, not from politicians, but from people we know and trust. So making use of these networks is very important. I've also talked about the value of what is already there. I suppose one danger we're really conscious of is that when we're trying to encourage this sort of activity, there's sometimes a rush to invent new programmes or implement what we think is a good idea without looking at what is already going on and how to support that. Because that action, that's what we risk losing if austerity cuts or other measures force the keen Greens to contract their activities or the incidental Greens to cancel their green projects in favour of their core priorities. Finding a level playing field as well. This was touched on earlier, and I'm really glad it was, about how do we measure value. People recognise that there is intrinsic value in these projects, but how do we demonstrate that? Not everybody has got money to invest in academic research to prove the financial value of their projects, the savings that they might be making to various organs of government. Is there a common language we can be using? Are there people in this room that can help organisations develop that? It is part of a wider conversation, but yeah, can we move beyond just looking at monetary figures? I know the concept of best value already exists, so the service that's going to provide the best value is not necessarily the cheapest, but how many organisations from any sector do prioritise equally social and environmental outcomes as well as economic ones? So it's a challenge for all of us, and I think that's mainly what we're looking at. I think that's a really important part of work, and perhaps the various partners here today can explore if there are ways of making that sort of business case for supporting community action. Because then funding will be seen as an investment rather than a subsidy. People are talking about, these sort of groups and these projects, they need to move away from grant dependency. And I'm thinking no one talks about the police being grant dependent. Nobody talks about truancy officers or the health services being grant dependent, because they're providing a service. And quite often these sorts of projects are providing a service as well. But frequently the organisations delivering them don't have necessarily the skills, certainly not the time or capacity to make that business case to those around them. But it's something that we can perhaps work towards promoting others, to fully look at the range of outcomes, in our purchasing power, our purchasing requirements, for example. Someone recently told me that as soon as you put the word community in front of anything, a centre, a woodland, a recycling service, people seem to expect that it can be done for free or for less money than if you were employing a private contractor. And that just undermines this whole thing about, yes, moving away from grant dependency. So, unfortunately, I've given you quite a lot of challenges and barriers and not necessarily having the answers. As I said, some of those large environmental organisations have credible academic research to demonstrate the value of what they're doing. As far as I know, there is no research to date to explore the value that the third sector brings to building social capital. And social capital seems to be the first line of defence in, for example, extreme weather events, or it is, if when the floods come, when those extreme weather events come, it's the churches, it's the community groups that are able to act quickly alongside other partners. So we don't know what we risk losing if we let community action fall by the wayside. And with these times of austerity and public sector cuts and all the rest of it, that is a concern for many groups that we're working with. So thank you for giving me the time to say all that. I hope I've been able to give a flavour of some of the community action on climate change that we're currently aware of and supporting, and probably you know much more, and some of the lessons that we've gained ourselves from working in this field for the last 22 years. I haven't been there for all of it. All right. Thank you very much.
Claire, stay by the microphone, please.
Right.
Just a couple, I'm sure that people will have questions, but I just wondered if you could just say a little bit about your 5 tailored grant schemes, what each of them is, how much money you have to spend, and what the average grant allocation is.
Okay. Our grant pot is about £600,000 a year. Our maximum grant size is £12,000, so we're talking fairly small potatoes. We have start-up grants up to £1,000 to help groups get going. Training grants of up to £600 for anything that will help your project build capacity. So it doesn't have to be woodland management or species identifying. It can be bookkeeping or IT skills or whatever that project needs. Feasibility support of up to £6,000 for whatever you need to get your project from the pre-project to project stage. So if it's an ecological survey or a feasibility study into a potential new business venture, those are, provided it's for a green enterprise, those are things that would fit there. Project grants of up to £10,000 for just doing what it is that you want to do, and management grants of up to £12,000 for the employment of staff. So typically they're volunteer coordinators or project officers, education officers, as long, as I said, as they're projects that deliver environmental benefit across a very wide spectrum and are community-led and involve volunteers.
Okay, thanks. And how many people do you assess that Environment Wales has influenced through your 300 projects?
Oh, blimey. Well, this year for our annual bid to the Welsh Government, I was asked to set tangible targets for what we were going to achieve. And that was quite difficult because the whole point, we think, is that we are demand-led. We don't go marching in saying, oh, you have to do an energy efficiency project, or you should do this, because we don't find that works. We find going to people and helping them develop their own ideas is what works. But I gave it a shot, and I estimated that climate change is one of the 5 different areas that we have to deliver on. And I estimated that probably next year we'll support at least 1,000 volunteers doing climate change activities within 50 projects that would reach about 20,000 staff beneficiaries and further volunteers.
So for £600,000, well targeted by being delivered by an inspirational leader and team, you are having a massive effect in communities in Wales on projects they themselves have identified. And I think that's really important. So it's Clare, the work that Clare and the development officers do, these are communities which are dreaming, isn't it? They're dreaming about what is a better life in their own communities and what they want to do about it. And I just think that it's worth anybody here who hasn't, who's representing a community interest, who hasn't applied for a grant for Environment Wales or hasn't had a discussion with a development officer, those opportunities are there to you all. But the Future Generations Bill, with its focus on prevention, should ensure there's a great deal more activity of the kind of activity that Clare and colleagues are doing. Not just in the environment, but the way in which the economic, social and environmental pillars interact with each other. So questions to Clare. Or anybody who's received an Environment Wales grant, want to say a little bit about what they've done with it?
You've got money which Premiership and also CAT. Just wondered if you can give us a flavour of some of the projects that are currently running, or perhaps have run, successful project in the county.
Oh, I should have looked at my map. One long-standing project we've got in the county is Tresordi. I don't know if you know it. Yeah.
It's our
Yeah.
resource centre.
Yeah. Tresordi came to us, blimey, six or 7 years ago, when they had a feasibility study, but they didn't yet have a lease for their scrap store. They run a very good scrap store, which also has a very strong educational side and promotes the 3Rs message. They came to us when they just had a feasibility study, but no secured venue. They applied for a management grant, and we said, your project looks amazing, but we can't fund it yet. Well, because grants are so competitive, and there were many other projects that were more ready to go. You know, it had all the potential, but it didn't yet have a venue. So we kept in touch with them, and they came back the next year when they did have a venue for their scrap store. They've had a management grant, they've had other training and project grants, and we're still working with them. And we hold our meetings there whenever we're in the county, and that's something I'd encourage everyone to do. If you're looking for meeting venues, if you can hold them at a community project, that's a really valuable source of income from them. So you'll probably be aware of Llanelli Environment Network. We funded them, and most recently the Environment Network has a website, and it's trying to link and promote environmental activity within the town. But recently they've also started a biodiversity monitoring project, just encouraging people to take note of the wildlife on their patch and report it via the website, so we've given them funding for that. Through our Supporting Sustainable Living scheme, which did have a specific focus on climate change, we're also funding a project that involves Canolfan and 4 town or community councils within Wales to engage communities in helping develop emergency response plans, and Llanelli is one of those councils.
Very forward thinking.
Okay, other questions?
How often will we be able to approach you for
Okay. Projects go through a registration process with us, and those applications are looked at every month. That's our chance to give projects, check out their SD credentials, but also to make sure their governance is in place, their policies, anything that might be a potential barrier to funding. After that, once you're registered, usually you can have one of each grant per year if your applications are strong enough. So we try and spread the pot, obviously as wide as we can, but you can come back to us year after year. We're there to provide continuity. It's not like you can have a grant this year and then see you again in 3 years' time.
Okay, any other comments or questions? Or has what Claire has been talking through, and I thought it was really interesting, if you think about the larger organisations like BTCV, where they can demonstrate that their voluntary programme and their carbon army, in fact, has shown that for every £1 spent, it probably saves the NHS £4. That's exactly the kind of principles that will underpin the preventative types approach through the Future Generations Bill, because you'll then be able to have quantitative evidence about the effect. And so many people across the years have said, why can't that be taken into account? We know these activities save the NHS money, why can't they be taken into account? And this approach will allow that to be taken into account. And similarly, in the context of work, I think it was groundwork that have done the work showing that for every £1 spent by groundwork, that you've saved an equivalent amount of money in the criminal justice system.
Yeah, and that's within 6 months. So
and that's just immediate, isn't it? And then if we think about the positive impacts on those young people in particular, and where they might then be able to go with their skills they've acquired, it's really positive agenda overall. So these are the sorts of ideas that are absolutely at the heart of the Future Generations. Any other questions, comments for Claire before we move on? Peachy, have another go then?
Just on that last point about the research, most voluntary groups and most small community groups don't have the expertise and time and resources to do that sort of research. Now, presumably there is a role for organisations like this university to do that, so that those broader impacts are researched and documented as well.
You're absolutely right, and certainly as a university, we're actually looking potentially at funding some graduate opportunities to research areas which are of importance regionally and locally, UK-wide and globally, in relation to issues around sustainability. But I think there are some broader issues also for the Welsh Government, and I know somebody is here from the Welsh Government today, about ensuring that, as Peter was saying in his contribution, that the measures of progress mean that there is appropriate research that can therefore give us both qualifiable and quantifiable outcomes for the future. Claire, thank you very, very much indeed. A chance for anybody now to have opportunities to engage with Environment Wales. Thank you very much.